Our next speaker is Colonel Dr. Douglas Macgregor. Dr. Macgregor is a decorated combat veteran, the author of 4 books and a PhD, and he is currently the Executive Vice President of Burke Macgregor Group, which is a defense and foreign policy consulting firm in Reston, Virginia. He was commissioned in the U.S. Army in 1976 after 4 years at West Point and 1 year at the VMI. In 1991, in the Gulf War, Colonel Macgregor was awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor for his personal leadership of the cavalry troops that destroyed a full-strength Iraqi Republican Guard brigade in the action known as the Battle of the 73 Easting, the U.S. Army's largest tank battle since World War II. In 1999, Colonel Macgregor supervised the conduct and planning of operations during the Kosovo air campaign. In January 2002, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld insisted that General Franks meet with Macgregor to discuss Colonel Macgregor's concept for the attack on Baghdad, and Macgregor's offensive was largely adopted. He has testified before Congress and appears as a commentator on national security affairs on television and radio programs. Colonel Macgregor will talk about challenges to contemporary advanced military organizations. Colonel Macgregor, please.
Before I speak, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a special privilege, of course, to celebrate your 20th anniversary. And I would like, first of all, to share a 1973 Yom Kippur memory that I have, which may surprise many of you. In 1973, I was sitting, actually I was standing at attention at the time at West Point. West Point in those days was quite different from what it is today. It was very highly disciplined, and we went to school 6 days a week. We had very little free time. We lived largely in isolation from the world, and so we had absolutely no idea that a war was happening anywhere in the world, other than Vietnam, which was then winding down. And our instructor came in the morning, ordered us to sit, and we expected to start yet another happy hour and a half of mechanical engineering. And he looked at us and he said, "Gentlemen, are you aware that there is a war today in the Middle East?" And of course, we had absolutely no idea, and he was well aware of that. And he said, "You need to understand what's happening." And he said, "The Egyptians have crossed the Suez Canal, and they are moving towards Israel." He said, "You need to understand that if these Egyptians reach the Mitla Pass, we will commit U.S. Army forces from Germany and the United States. We will not allow Israel to be overrun by the Arabs." We sat there and listened to this, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And finally, my classmate who was sitting next to me leaned over and whispered, he said, "I don't know where the hell the Mitla Pass is, but if it'll get me out of mechanical engineering, I'm for this war." Little did I realize that about 17 and a half years later, I would be in a tank leading 1,100 men, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys in an attack out of a sandstorm through minefields and artillery fire into the teeth of a Republican Guard formation. At the time, we thought we might ultimately fight the Russians or the North Koreans. We had no idea where we would end up, which I think reinforces to some extent my predecessor's comments. You can never be absolutely sure when and where you will fight. So with that in mind, I'm just going to cover some things in a few slides that I hope will be interesting to you. The first in front of you is an attempt to try and convey an impression or understanding of what's happening today in the United States. I'm old enough to remember the attitude that people had after the Vietnam War, and that attitude today in the United States is very prevalent. There is no appetite or support in the American population today for any military intervention of any kind beyond the borders of the United States. This has nothing to do with Israel. This has everything to do with the last 20 years. You have to understand that after Desert Storm, we went through a long period of interventions in many, many places. Iraq was not really anomalous. It was simply an extension of this business of intervening in other places to create Western-style liberal democracies where they had absolutely no chance of success with American military power. The American people are fed up with it. They don't support it. They see it as a failure. It has cost us trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, tens of thousands of casualties, and cultivated whole new nations of enemies that we did not previously have. So that has to be understood. As you've seen recently in the context of Syria, there was no willingness under any circumstances to bomb anybody in Syria. It wasn't a case of careful study, evaluation, or analysis. It was simply, this is unacceptable, we won't support it. Our politicians do not lead public opinion, they follow it. It's very important to understand that. And when the phones rang off the hook in Washington, it died quickly. Second point is to understand that everything that happens in American foreign and defense policy has very little to do with what is going on overseas and everything to do with what's happening inside the United States. People posture politically inside the United States for political gain, and that explains much of what we do beyond our borders. It also explains the ridiculous criticism that we often mete out to other countries and peoples around the world for doing things that we judge to be morally incorrect. It's not a moral judgment of the American people. Again, it's posturing in Washington for votes with the American people. Now, in addition to these other issues, we've got serious economic problems, cultural problems, social problems. These things have been building for years. They have simply been exacerbated over the last 8 to 9 years to the point where we are now turning inward to deal with these problems. It is not a question of abandoning the world. We're simply focusing on things that we have ignored. So the most important statement for you to remember, in 1975, it was no more Vietnams. Today, it's no more Iraqs. And anything that smacks of an occupation is dead on arrival. And by the way, I happen to agree with that. Occupations are bad ideas, and we don't do them very well. Next slide. Before I came here, I went over to my friends at the Defense Intelligence Agency who are involved on a daily basis in looking at the Middle East, and I said, what do you think? What is your view? I am not an expert on the Middle East. I am not someone like Daniel Pipes who spends his time studying Arabs, Turks, and Persians. I'm sure it's interesting, but it's not one of my favorite things. And I said, what are we looking at in your view? I'm going to be talking to a group of Israelis. They said, well, near term, you have this axis or alignment, which they called the Khomeiniist Iran with Syria, Iraq, Hezbollah, and more distantly, Russia and India. And they made the point that Russia and India, for instance, are involved in this, not necessarily because they are hostile to Israel or the United States, but because they have commercial relations, transfers of technology, energy dependence, and so forth, that brings them into alignment with these states or movements. Long term, you have the Peninsular Arabs, North African Arabs, Turkey, Pakistan, and more distantly again, China. That is the other alignment. There is a clear understanding inside military intelligence, I'm not sure this is understood broadly in American society, that Islamists, whether they are Sunni or Shia, all agree on the criticality of reoccupying Israel and Islamicizing the Jewish state. That is not a matter for debate inside military circles. That's understood. The WMD threat. The view is that this top axis with Khomeiniist Iran, Syria, and Iraq, that will recede in terms of its lethality and threat to the West and to Israel in favor of the second axis, which most of the analysts think within the next 10 years will emerge as the dominant force in the Middle East. That is the Sunni Islamist axis, with Turkey primarily at its core, financed by Saudi Arabia, the Peninsular Arabs, and also supported and assisted distantly by China. Last point. The only state which the analysts believe has the capability, the culture, the cohesive society over the long term to pose a serious military challenge to Israel and to the West is Turkey. Now, post-industrial warfare, which is really what my predecessor and my colleagues have been discussing, is admittedly, we think, going to be different from previous forms of warfare. In an American context, this is how we see it. You have on the left-hand side the traditional paradigm of industrial warfare. Everything is service-based: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. War-fighting doctrines are service-oriented: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. Today, we see this not necessarily changing in a bureaucratic sense, although that is the long-term goal, I think, but we see warfighting on the operational level of war moving into something that we refer to as the post-industrial paradigm, or ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, plus strike on one side, and maneuver sustainment, that is maneuver and logistics, on the other. Remember that the United States is preeminently, historically, culturally, geographically, a maritime, aerospace power. We are not historically, culturally, geographically, a global land power. Our so-called empire, which grew up during the Cold War, is being dismantled. It's being dismantled because we cannot afford it. It's prohibitively expensive, it's increasingly unnecessary, and frankly, even counterproductive, as we've discovered when we poured hundreds of thousands of American troops into other people's countries where, surprise, surprise, they were not welcome. The important thing for you to understand is that the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance aspect is vital and essential. It is the heart of modern warfare. It is the ability to detect, to collect, to analyze information disseminated quickly, so that on the operational level, that is the level between the strategic and the tactical, capabilities in all of the services in terms of standoff attack or maneuver, that is ground force, or standoff attack from air, land, and sea, can be mobilized and employed effectively. Huge implications here for force design. Enormously important implications for how you build forces, what they look like. This is going to be with us for many years, and this is going to dominate the discussion in the United States and I think the Western world over the next 10 years. Now, in this connection, we've recently had a lot of attention directed to something called air-sea battle. Some of you may have heard of it. It was developed ostensibly for the purpose as ultimately being employed under certain circumstances against China, hopefully as a deterrent. How did this come about? Well, again, because we are very service-centric, unfortunately, the sovereign state of the United States Air Force met with the sovereign state of the United States Navy. They concluded a treaty and agreed that together they would, to a limited extent, integrate their capabilities for two purposes. First, to be employed in the South China Sea, the North China Sea, against the Chinese, if necessary, and secondly, to justify enormous investment in new platforms, technologies, and missiles for the sovereign state of the Air Force and the sovereign state of the Navy. If you look at it carefully, it is not a strategic concept. It is not even an operational concept. It is, in the words of the Secretary of the Navy, shown there, a guided munitions salvo competition. There are some problems with this. If all you are doing is launching large numbers of missiles from a distance, however explosive, however precise, in about a week, you've run out. There are no more. China, which is substantially behind the United States in every key category, at least 20 years behind, is large enough, populous enough to absorb all of those missiles, almost to the point where they will notice it, but it is not going to fundamentally change things in China. The problem with this reliance on precision-guided munitions and standoff attack, no matter how well informed it is, no matter how accurate it is that if that is your principal instrument, you are conducting the modern equivalent of siege warfare. And unfortunately, the larger the state, the more powerful the state, the less likely siege warfare is to succeed. So if you do not have an integrated ground force, And for our purposes, we have to have an integrated, capable ground force that can serve as the backbone, or at least the key component of a larger allied ground force. You are unlikely to persuade anyone with capability to do anything that you want. I would remind everybody, having directed the campaign, that the 78-day air campaign against the Serbs only ended when the Russians informed the Serbs that the Russians would no longer support them, with the promised aid and assistance that the Serbs needed to get through the winter. Because given our inability to effectively attack and destroy the dispersed Serbian ground forces in Kosovo, we ended up destroying infrastructure. Infrastructure is a very appealing target for the Air Force because it doesn't move. It also often makes no difference. So what are the implications, in my judgment, for the Israeli Defense Force? They're listed here, and you will note on the left, I'm thinking 10 years out. Look at those photographs and keep in mind that's the kind of capability that could emerge over the next 10 years. When this Sunni-Shia struggle ends in 10 years, I think that there is a very high probability for an advanced conventional war in this region. I'm not saying it's an absolute certainty, but that potential is very good. At the same time, you're still going to have this irregular war of attrition that insurgents or terrorists wage on a routine basis. So, Israeli ground forces today need to be built over time with the goal in mind of being able to conduct decisive operations on land in 5 to 10 years. That's not an easy thing, by the way, but it has to happen. And what do we want them to do? These forces, and our ground forces are quite similar, must be able to punch above their weight, because in our case, we are not going to mobilize. So we have to use forces in being, professional forces in being. These forces have to mobilize fighting power disproportionate to their size, high lethality, low density. They have to have the capability to close with the enemy. We are still going to have to kill people, as we discovered in '91, as we discovered in 2003, as we discovered again in 2012. We will still have to close with and kill the enemy at close range. To do that, you need mobile armored firepower. Men with rifles, based on my personal experience, die in great numbers very quickly. They are a very fragile capability. You need extremely good expert light infantry, but in small numbers, employed very carefully. Employed in large numbers, they are at enormous risk. Finally, at the bottom, these forces must be integrated within that maneuver, strike, ISR sustainment paradigm on the operational level. We have too many chains of command in the United States Armed Forces, Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine. It's about jobs for generals. It's about individual service acquisition programs, toys for generals. We can't afford it. It's beyond our capability. We are going to have to compress these operational level echelons of command into integrated joint commands. We will have Air Force generals, Navy admirals in many cases commanding ground forces. We will have ground commanders, in some cases commanding naval and air forces. But within this integrated framework, where it is transparent on the tactical level to the people doing the fighting, who is above them on the operational level. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my presentation. Thank you again for listening, and I hope we have some good questions.